Good morning, brothers, sisters, and friends in the Boston area. We're loving here, even though I'm thousands and thousands of miles away. Warm greetings from Edinburgh in Scotland.
Come on, Dougie.
Which is the top part of the United Kingdom. It's a beautiful city. It's a beautiful area. We love everything about it. From the wildlife to the weather, and even the proximity to family, which was the main reason we moved here. When people ask me what it is that I do, like I saw on the airplane a couple of months ago, I tell them my job is to make people think about faith. Occasionally I use the word theologian, but not everyone understands that one. But helping us to think about faith, to examine our faith, is so important. Not just as people are coming to faith, but in the years that follow to continue to grow. I do this in various ways. For example, the podcast that comes out every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, which I hope you'll sign up for. As Albert mentioned, and overwhelmingly, also as an introduction, I do debates. Even last year, before we year, well, we didn't have our audience, also people couldn't show up, we had a cameraman. I had my first ever debate with someone else who believes in the Bible. And we had a debate, our first debate was on baptism. I think these are important things to do. I also help people think about faith by leading tours to places like Israel, or Italy, or Greece, or Turkey. Turkey, you can see in the rectangle, that's where the Apostle Paul spent so much time. In fact, most of the visits he makes in the New Testament are in that area. I'll be there with the group in just a couple of weeks. We even have a tour coming up, the prison journey of Paul, with Malta, Sicily, and Italy. And maybe one day you can join and watch the Bible come to life when you walk where Jesus walked, where you go in the steps of the apostles. Another thing that's very rewarding is producing short messages that can be used in underground churches around the world. This is the iFaith series. I've done 96 of them so far, and they're really fun. You watch them, you talk about them, you can discuss them. They're all at YouTube. Yes, I'm a professor in a couple of different master's degree programs. I was grading assignments just a few minutes ago, in fact. And also with Joey Harris, I lead the Athens Institute. This is all about biblical training, a program we started in 2004, although it grew out of the original MTP in London in 1995. Giving answers to Bible questions is one thing, but helping people to think through the scriptures to find their own answers, I think that's actually more valuable. I and many other men and women are convinced it's important to link up, to mentor teachers globally, to raise people up. And so I've worked with people all over the world and all the continents, and this is tremendously edifying. I write books, that's one of the recent ones, and even some travel, though a lot of the travel lately has been by Zoom. But if you can see the small print, earlier this year, I had the privilege of speaking for Worcester, Providence, and Burlington, and now I'm back virtually again in Boston, which, by the way, was my home 40 years ago. It's where my father was born also. Well, the presentation today is titled Faith in an Atheistic World. I didn't come up with that. Valdur Koha came up with that title. And maybe he was just suggesting it as a subject. I thought, that'll work. That'll work really well. I would love to talk about that. After sharing just a few introductory considerations, I want to set the stage so that we have the right attitude. We'll look at some of the common objections that those who do not believe or cannot believe offer. We'll consider not all, but just a few of those objections. And then in the third part, we'll look at why believing in God makes sense. And that itself may be a new thought to you, but I think you'll see why I title it that way. And then I'll have a few challenges at the very end. Well, maybe it's important to be clear on terminology. Atheism is the position that there's no God. It's not uncertainty, it's more like a confidence. Theism is the opposite. That means we believe in God. Both of these words come from the Greek word theos. Theos means God. So atheist is not God. Agnostic is one who says that God is unknowable. Maybe there's a God, maybe not, but we could not know. Although many people who don't always do the hard work of thinking and studying call themselves agnostics, probably they're more like soft agnostics. That is, they're simply saying, I don't know. I was in a hotel room in Oxford, just a few hundred miles south of where I am here, in Northern Europe, and I looked in the bedside table, and there was a drawer, and I pulled out a Gideon's Bible. It was an old translation. And someone had written in there, warning, fiction. I thought, okay, that's probably not a believer. But underneath it, in a different color, was written Psalm 92, 5 and 6. And in case you're not clear on what that is, that's the passage that says, O Lord, how great are thy works, and thy thoughts very deep. A brutish man knoweth not, neither doth a fool understand this. I guess that was the retort to the warning from the skeptic or the atheist. Here you have the theist showing such great humility that anyone who doesn't agree with the Bible must be brutish and foolish. And yet, as you may know, particularly if you read the Bible, it's not entirely fair. Because when it says the fool says in his heart there's no God in the Psalms, it's referring not to atheists, it's referring to those who are in the religious system. Now, my title, Faith in an Atheistic World. Is our world actually atheistic? Well, for many of us, the world we move in might as well be. Though, to be fair, in most of the world, most people believe in a God or multiple gods. The largest parts of the world that are atheistic would be probably Europe, China, which has hundreds of millions of atheists, and believe it or not, the United States has a huge number of atheists now. But why would our world be so atheistic? Well, in the cases of communist countries, the former Soviet Union, places like China, or say the 5 remaining communist countries like Cuba, Laos, and so forth, it's state atheism. 2 generations or more have been indoctrinated in atheism, and so that continues. And yet, the Bible speaks of a different kind of atheism, which I just referred to also. The fool says in his heart there's no God. And you read that verse, and you read the next sentence, and you realize he's not talking about a skeptic. He's talking about someone who has no excuse, who should know better. It's not the outsider whose challenge, it's the insider. But why has atheism found such a strong hold in our society? When I say our society, I imagine most of you listening to this are in North America or Europe, or places like South Africa or Australia, Western culture. We have an exalted view of reason since the Enlightenment, since the last 300 or 400 years, and we tend to trust ourselves. We tend to assume we're objective. Now, am I claiming to be objective? I'm doing my best in this presentation, but of course I have my own bias. This is my 45th year as a Christian. You could say I'm in quite a groove. Someone else might say a rut. I try to listen to the different voices, and I try to weigh them and to be fair. And yet, the Bible tells me not to put too much confidence in reason, even while the Bible says, come now, let us reason together, Isaiah 1. I think our culture is also atheistic because we have an overwhelming success in the area of science and technology, and that leads us to put great faith in science and technology. When longevity was less, when pandemics could wipe out whole populations, in times where the world, the universe was not well understood, people felt more of a need for God or the gods. Now it seems like everything's covered, from birth to death and everything in between. And so the average non-believer can go through an entire day not even thinking about God. But to be honest, even as believers, we can go through a whole day not relying on God because life is easy and quite predictable. And one last thought, why is our world so atheistic? I think, to be fair, those who claim to represent God have not set the best example. In fact, sometimes a very poor example. Well, what are some of the reasons that unbelievers throw out? What are some of the common atheist objections? This has got to be one that I hear the most. There's no proof of God. And of course, I'll say, well, what kind of proof do you mean? Do you mean photographic proof? You mean scientific proof? Because science is only good at proving physical things. God's not physical. What do you mean? When the Soviets put the first men in space, and this was before the Americans, now some almost 60 years ago, they said basically, I didn't see God anywhere in the heavens. Of course, if they had seen God, maybe an old man orbiting the earth on a platinum throne, I think we all know that wouldn't be God. We would have to have a different explanation. When those cosmonauts were up there, they couldn't see the cosmic radiation either. They couldn't see atoms. And it's not because space is empty. Space is not empty, it just has fewer atoms. But there are a lot of things that are real, even though you can't see them. And there are many parts of reality that science itself cannot prove, like logic. So what do you mean, science cannot prove logic? Well, it can't prove it. It makes assumptions. You can't use logic to prove logic. That would be circular. Science cannot prove numbers. I mean, I believe in the number 5 and the number 7, and I have no problem with this. But you could say, well, how do you weigh them? How do they smell? What color are they? Science can't prove morality, beauty, love, justice, many other things. Even science cannot prove science. That would be circular. And yet, what it is to be a human involves relationship, it involves love. It involves a quest for things like justice. Just because we cannot say, what is a kilogram of justice, or what is 5 yards of love, doesn't mean these things aren't real. Because there are many things that are real that science cannot tell us about. And so, if you only believe in science, and you think the only real world is that which science can discover, that's not science, that's scientism. That's elevating science beyond what it's meant to do. As one professor put it, don't blame your microscope that it can't make a good cup of coffee. Okay, we have an espresso machine. I don't use a microscope for that, and if I had a microscope, I wouldn't blame it for not being able to make espresso. It's not meant for that. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal just this past week, I believe just 4 days ago, 5. And Michael Gillen, who started as an atheist, mentions that atheism's central conceit is that it's a worldview grounded in evidence. That has nothing to do with faith. Of course, faith is weak. In reality, this book goes on, and this article explained, faith is central to atheism, logic, and even science. If you think about it, take something simple like geometry. It seems obvious to us looking at triangles and squares and parallelograms, but in geometry, they're basic axioms. Like one thing is equal to another thing that has the same measure, or 2 equals added to each other lead to equals also. We have to start somewhere. Most of the universe is not observable. And it's not because our telescopes aren't powerful enough. It's because there's dark matter and dark energy. No, this is not related to the dark web, but you may well have heard of these. And so science itself is not even able to yet explore even the physical universe. When people say there's no proof, again, I would say, well, what kind of proof do you mean? What are you looking for? Scientific proof of God, we will not find. But we can find traces of his presence. We can find a different kind of evidence, more like forensic evidence. In the courtroom, they don't always have the video of the crime, but there's testimony, and there are many factors that can be weighed. It's also often said that science and faith are somehow opposed. The late Christopher Hitchens said, and I'll just read the second paragraph here, religion has run out of justifications. Thanks to the telescope and the microscope, it no longer offers us an explanation of anything important. That again from the late Christopher Hitchens. This is one of the so-called 4 horsemen of the atheist apocalypse. Because in the last 20 years or so, many atheists have not used so much serious argumentation to refute theism, but more, let's say, flowery language and wild claims, even though I read these men and their books. But this is the view, that science and faith are hopelessly opposed. I like the analogy one physicist used, John Polkinghorne, who was a physicist turned Anglican priest. He said, when you look at the kettle boiling, and this looks like our kettle here in Scotland, we have a lot of tea. You could say, well, why is it boiling? What's happening? Well, the temperature inside has been raised beyond the boiling point of water based on our elevation. We're at 400 feet above sea level right here. And at a certain point, then, okay, we can talk about that. But there's a different way to answer the question that doesn't involve temperature or motion. It's boiling because my wife wants a cup of tea. Now, is that the non-scientific view? Like, it's wrong? No, it's completely correct. They're both right. The scientific view is right, and the normal human relational view is okay. But often people don't get this, and there's this false dichotomy. Well, you have to choose between evolution and faith. Well, maybe you do, but I'm not so sure. It's not a topic of the Bible. And evolution or development concerns how life came to be, but not why. And as a result, Charles Darwin himself, author of Origin of Species, said that it seems absurd to me, he said, to doubt that someone can be an ardent theist and an evolutionist. An ardent theist, a passionate believer in God, and be an evolutionist. Darwin didn't see why they were contradictory. Neither did the late Billy Graham, who said that I believe God did create the universe. I believe that God created man. Whether it came by an evolutionary process, at a certain point he took the person or being and made him a living soul or not, does not change the fact that God did not create man. Whichever way God did it makes no difference as to what man is and man's relationship to God. You may not agree with Graham, but actually I think he was on the right track. Of course, I'm fascinated with this kind of, these kinds of matters. How did the world come to be, and how should we interpret the early part of Genesis? I was honored to be able to co-author a book with philosopher and apologist Paul Copan, a book called Origins, on the ancient impact and the modern implications of Genesis 1 to 11. We're wondering, how did the dinosaurs fit on the ark? Or we're asking, how old is the earth? We're asking questions that the text is not meant to answer. To read it as it was meant to be read, that was our project. I've been to the opera once in my life, and it was a good one. It was Puccini's Turandot. And amazing, the music, the stage, the singing, the passion, the emotion that I normally don't feel in the course of a day. I felt so much of it in an opera of all places. Now, someone could say, well, it's just acoustics. It's musical notes and sounds following physical laws, and you can see the physical, all right, everyone knows, SPL equals 20, etc. Well, that may be true, but cannot it not be more than that? If I'm listening to a symphony, it's surely more than just strings vibrating, or little black notes on paper, on parallel lines. It's not that it isn't that, but it's more than that. And if you think it's just dots on paper or sound waves going through a symphony hall, you're missing something, not only what it is to be human, but I think you're missing part of reality. Because reality is not only the physical, that which can be measured with instruments. In fact, at least since the 4th century BC, Christians have spoken of God's two books. God speaks to us in Scripture, of course, but also in nature. Scripture is his book of words, nature is his book of works, and they don't contradict each other. Francis Bacon said, let no one out of conceit or laziness think that he can be too well informed in God's book of words or his book of works, religion or science. Instead, let everyone endlessly improve their understanding of both. And this is what the Bible itself teaches. Psalm 104, Psalm 19, Romans 1, that God speaks to us in Scripture, yes, but also in nature, which makes science a valid enterprise to see how God has done it. And by the way, before we go on to the next objection, many scientists believe in God. According to the surveys, if more than 40%, I think it's 42%, believe in a personal God, probably a lot more believe in a God who's not personal. At any rate, it's not fair to say, or it's not right to assume that scientists don't believe in God. One of the scientific organizations I'm a member of is the American Scientific Affiliation. If you're interested in these topics, you might want to check out www.asa3.org. Here's a common objection: the church is full of hypocrites. Of course, the answer is it's not full yet. There's still space. There's always room for one more. Because to claim that we're consistent and we're never hypocritical, if we're honest, we know that's not really fair. And that's why passages like Matthew 7, where Jesus says, when you're judging the other while you've got the log in your eye, why passages like that hit us hard. It's not just the hypocrisy of those who flout Jesus' teachings. We see this in the church using torture, getting involved in the political realm with the Crusades or the Inquisition, or sleazy televangelists asking for more money. It's easy to say, oh yeah, embarrassing things were done in church history. But hypocrisy is here right now. It's in every household. It's something we have to really watch out for. But always remember, just because something is done in the name of Christ does not mean that Christ approves it. And if you know a Christian who's really let you down, it doesn't mean that what he's promoting, if he's telling you read the Bible, it doesn't mean that that's false. He's simply not a good representative of something that is otherwise a very good thing. Now, here's an interesting one. Maybe you've heard this before. And again, there are probably 10 or 20 objections. I'm only taking a handful. I'm sorry if I don't get to yours. Some would say the universe is simply so enormous that we can't really matter. Now, in this picture, you can see the Earth. You need an arrow to show you which one it is. The Earth is about 1,000th of the size of Jupiter. So here's the Earth, here's Jupiter, and Jupiter is huge. And right now, Jupiter is very close to the Earth. I looked out at the sky 2 nights ago. It was incredibly bright. I've never seen Jupiter so bright. Well, the Earth fits inside Jupiter more than 1,000 times. And Jupiter fits inside the sun more than 1,000 times. And our sun is just an average star. In our galaxy, there are at least 100 billion stars, maybe 200 billion. And how many galaxies are there with 100 billion stars or more? At least 100 billion. And how big is our universe? Well, we don't use miles. Scientists measure things in light years, how far light can go in a year. And that's keeping up the hefty velocity of 300,000 kilometers every second. That's like going around the Earth. If a photon was going around the Earth at the equator, it would go around it more than 7 times in 1 second. That's fast. It's a huge universe. And yet to say, well, we must be insignificant, interestingly, goes counter to many things that science shows us. For example, that if the universe were not approximately its current age, which is thought to be almost 14 billion years, if it were not so huge, that is 30, I don't know exactly how to measure the diameter on this, but probably close to 30 billion light years across. If it weren't that size and that age, probably there would be no life in the universe. So it actually needed to be that big. This is far more than we can go into here, even though I'm very interested. Whoops, I've accidentally clicked on a link. Interesting, it must have been, I didn't realize that. I went to NASA. So where I got that cool picture is Astronomy Picture of the Day. And you can sign up for that too. It's really cool. All right. Number 5, it will be said, well, I can't believe in God because it's so easy to show the concept of God doesn't make sense. He can't really do the impossible. One question I hear, have you heard this before? If God created everything, who created God? And the people ask that as though they're stumping you. If you're asked that kind of a question, deconstruct the sentence. God is uncreated by definition. So we could rewrite the sentence, who created the uncreated? And now it doesn't make any sense, does it? Or this humorous one, could God create a rock so big that even he couldn't move it? You have this idea of an Atlas-type being struggling with all of his might. But again, the question doesn't make sense. Because we're asking, could God create an movable object? An object that cannot be moved, but which is moved? Well, when you reword it that way, it doesn't make sense. It's actually absurd. And so I would distinguish, and if you're an atheist, please concentrate. I think this could be a helpful distinction. The difference between relative and absolute impossibility. Now, we'll get out of this philosophical section in just a moment, but hang on. It's relatively impossible that someone named Richard, maybe Hislop, for example, could bench press a Rolls Royce. It's not absolutely impossible. What do you mean, if he used lots of steroids? No. If he was on the moon, the Rolls Royce would only weigh about 1/6 of what it does here. And think of it that way. It's relatively impossible. Think of Irene Kohat flying through the atmosphere just using her arms. Now, she can't do that here in New England or here in Scotland. But imagine a place where there was low gravity like the moon, but there was an atmosphere, which the moon doesn't have. And it was a thick atmosphere. And it'd be nice also if there were some good winds. Well, it's possible that you could actually fly in such a situation. But other things are absolutely impossible. So I mean by absolutely, under no possible construction of reality can it happen. It is, in other words, nonsense. People say, what about loud silence? Could God make loud silence? Well, of course not. Silent, non-silent, that's not a tough act for God. That's something that's absurd. Or a 19-ounce pint, or even something like the smell of the color 11. I mean, what does it even mean? So don't be caught up by such questions. If there were a God, sixthly, I think he would take away all suffering. And to be honest, this is probably the most common objection I hear, particularly as I'm talking to men and women, all ages, all cultures, all continents. At some point, this bothers people, and I think it should. Now, the objection is at least 2,500 years old, though the recent four horsemen of the atheist apocalypse have brought it up again. But much I would like to say here. The basic thinking that the skeptic has is that given suffering, an all-powerful and good deity would do something about it. Of course, biblically, we would say he has, maybe not the way you would expect. But they'll say that God's all-powerful, sure, but he's not good. Otherwise, he would get involved. Or he's quite good, but he simply doesn't have the juice to do it. Of course, there's also the possibility that he's all good and all-powerful, and this is not his agenda. And in fact, there are actually two problems with suffering. The first one is a logical problem. How can God let such horrible things happen? And of course, the answer has something to do with free will. And there's also the emotional problem. Why shouldn't I hate a God who allows such suffering? Wow. We cannot go into this. I had 3 hours I could. If you're interested, please visit my website, sign up for the free weekly newsletter, and you'll get a free book. And the book is called When God is Silent, The Problem of Human Suffering, because I cannot do it justice right now, for which I apologize. Well, those are some of the common objections. I can think of others. But let's talk about theism. Does theism make sense? Well, I believe we live in a moral universe. Now, when I say moral universe, I don't mean that the wind is alive and trees can be good or bad. They have their own will. I don't mean that kind of universe. I mean a universe where some things are right and wrong. The German philosopher Nietzsche, who was far and away the most consistent of all European philosophers, said God is dead and we have killed him. Now, he didn't mean that God literally had died or been assassinated. He said functionally, we've killed God. And that means there is no morality. Nietzsche said, and you can read this, he's quite enjoyable to read. Read his book, Beyond Good and Evil. He says that there are no such thing as moral actions or immoral actions. Nothing you could do. I mean, you could strangle your pet or your friend, or you could burn a building down with people inside. That's not moral. It's not immoral. It's neither. He says they're only moral interpretations. People may feel something's right or wrong, but nothing is right or wrong. And yet, if there is no God, I believe that he is correct. No one can be moral if there is no morality, if there's no transcendent moral order, if there's no God, no one can be moral. But what's moral? Well, you have to measure it somehow. I mean, We visited, day before yesterday, we visited a castle that was built in the 12th century. You might say, well, that's old. Well, I don't know, is that old? I mean, the rocks it was made out of may be billions of years old. Oh, well, that's really old. Yeah, but it's kind of young for the universe. Yeah, if someone says, this guy is tall or this person is short, what's the measure? How do we decide if something is good or evil, fair or unfair? In society, normally we take a vote. It's a consensus. But is that why murder is wrong, just because we agree? Or is it truly wrong? I submit that we need a God, external to our universe. There are absolute morals, as nearly every human being admits, even atheists, and as we experience. Surely we would agree that rape is wrong, always. Torturing babies, serial killing. Some serial killers have no conscience. I did a sermon here in the UK about 2 months back, and I talked about some serial killers, and particularly Dennis Nilsen, whom I met just a few weeks before he was caught. This fellow strangled and cooked and ate the people he killed. Is this right or wrong? He didn't think it was wrong. Nietzsche would say it's not right or wrong. We think it's right or wrong, but it's really a matter of indifference because there's no God. That's right, if there's no God, it really, you can say, this displeases me, I find this disgusting or unpleasant, but on what basis is it actually wrong? Better think about that. So this argument goes, but there are morals, and therefore there is a God. That's the inference to a best explanation. There wouldn't be morality without God, but there is morality and immorality. There's right and wrong, and that means there must be a God. That makes sense. So please, I'm not saying that atheists cannot be moral. I remember a couple of debates I've had with atheists. They're thinking, oh, you're saying that we can't be moral. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying you can't be moral, and neither can I, if there's no God. Because it's his character that defines good and evil. If there's no God, then it's meaningless to talk about what's ultimately right or wrong. It's just preferences. It's what we do. It's what's useful, utilitarian. So please, I'm not saying that atheists cannot be moral. Often I've met atheists who are, in my opinion, more moral than people who believe. Well, another reason I think theism makes sense is that atheism is trying to prove a universal negative. That is, universally, there's no omniscient being. Well, how could you know that nowhere in the universe is there an all-knowing being? Wouldn't you have to ransack the whole universe? Wouldn't you have to have total knowledge? And so you would need to have that kind of knowledge in order to prove there is no being with total knowledge, which doesn't make sense. It's a fool's errand to try to prove a universal negative. To know if God or other spiritual beings doesn't exist in another dimension, I maybe would need myself to be interdimensional, but I'm not. I only live where I live. I just don't have access to all that information, thus I must be humble. If there's a God, then both meaning and purpose are real and lasting. Probably 115 plus years ago, Carl Jung said the central neurosis of our time is emptiness. Well, he may have said that in 1905, but it seems to be truer and truer in our era. A Christian philosopher named Francis Schaeffer said, if God is dead, then man is dead too. I mean, the loss is something we simply don't get over. Faith is not a bad thing, although it can be used in bad ways. The thing is, if there's no God, then what purpose do we really have? You could say, oh, I want to graduate, I want to get a raise, I want to buy a new house. Well, those are our temporary purposes, but in asking about meaning and purpose, we're speaking of what is ultimate and what is objective. Without God, what Ecclesiastes calls life under the sun, everything's empty, vanity, meaningless. But if there's a God, then we have a purpose. It's to know him. The scriptures say that God created us not to be his slaves, like in the ancient religions, humans are created to work for the gods. No, he created us to know him. And if we know God, then of course that will spill over into mission in our lives. Theism, fourthly, better answers the questions of origin and destiny. Like, where did the universe come from? Three possibilities. It's always existed, or it's caused by itself, or it's caused externally. Something outside the universe caused it. Well, has it always existed? No, not according to modern physics. The universe, and including time and space itself, time and space, matter, energy, come into existence at the Big Bang, the singularity, almost 14 billion years ago. So science would say it's not always existed. When I was a little boy, I thought it always existed, but that's not, if you think that, you're, well, probably 90 years behind the times. Well, if it hasn't always existed, it must have been caused. Did it cause itself to exist? I've actually heard people say that, but that makes no sense. How can something that doesn't exist yet cause itself to exist? By reaching back in time. Think about it, it doesn't make sense. What makes sense is that it's caused by something outside. Check out the Kalam cosmologic argument. Just write down K-A-L-A-M and look it up on the internet. It's very logical, very easy to follow. It's a medieval Muslim argument, which I find very convincing. But if our universe has a beginning, it's not without a beginning. If it's caused, not uncaused, and if it has personality in it, which it seems to have evidence of personality, then doesn't it make more sense that there's a God than that there's no God? This is not a scientific proof, but it's an inference to the best explanation. In terms of destiny, those who believe in God, theists, understand that time is linear. It doesn't simply go around in circles, it's heading somewhere. And because it's a moral universe, there's a day of reckoning, because this life is not fair. One reason I believe there's something on the other side is that good should be rewarded and evil punished, and this does not happen in our world except partially. Destiny, relationship. We enter into God's eternity, and the Bible speaks beautifully of creation, fall, and new creation, something that we're experiencing already. But the destiny is glorious, something amazing. I'm God's child, and that means I'm called to respect others as God's children. I don't mean that they're God's children necessarily. They've been born of water and the Spirit as followers of Jesus Christ. I use the word as Paul, the apostle, used it in Athens, that we're all God's children, whether we're in a right relationship with him or not. But what am I, or who am I? One of my earliest memories was being lost in a supermarket. My mother was probably one aisle away. I remember feeling so alone, so desperate. That's a feeling that I think some adults have. Who am I? Am I ultimately unreal? Is the world unreal, as Hinduism and Buddhism teach? Am I simply a sack of chemicals? You could get 7 pounds 23 if you cooked me up and took the crystals and sold them to a pharmacy? Am I just an animal? Of course, biblically, we are animals and we are chemicals. We're made from dirt and we are animals, but we're above the animals. Or am I a child of God? So theism has a lot to say about identity. And if we don't know who we are, then that affects how we relate to others. That is relationship. Are others ultimately irrelevant? Are they just things? Are they extras on the stage of my life? Or are these people who are special to God, precious? Theism actually values humanity, and it's tolerant, at least when we treat others as expressing the image of God. Atheistic ideologies and regimes particularly usually exhibit zero tolerance, zero latitude for differences of opinion. The individual doesn't count, only the collective. And so this is why I think theism makes sense. It gives good answers to the big existential questions. Where we come from? Where are we going? Who are we? How would we relate to others? What's the meaning of life? What's a purpose? How about morality? What's right and wrong? Ethics, how do we treat others? The big questions are answered very well by theism, and yet atheism, I don't think its answers are so good. So a few final thoughts here. 5 quick thoughts and I'll let you go. Proverbs 18:17, don't just believe whatever you find on the internet. Okay, it's not exactly what the passage says, but it's very similar. But I'm urging you to think through these issues, to think through, to slow down, to be skeptical, of what you hear and to actually go to sources if possible. Find out what people really said and find out what the Bible really says. Secondly, following God is a matter of relationship, not religion. The Bible's not a book of rules, and if you feel it is, then of course it's going to seem very burdensome. The way, and Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. The way is more of a person than a system. So we need to zero in on Jesus to understand biblically. We're talking about the existence of God. You could argue, does Douglas really have a wife? That's my wife, Vicky. Or is it? Well, there's all kinds of evidence. I mean, birth certificate, their children, you could do DNA. I was just with my mother-in-law a few days ago. But the most important thing is our relationship. It's not about facts, although there are facts. It's about relationship, and that's the way the Bible is. Number 3, finding God is no mere academic pursuit. Everything rides on our response. This world is not all there is. That's just the downstairs. There's the upstairs. And it's not just the present. There really is a future coming, a new age. And those who ignore God are skating on thin ice, or in this instance, I guess they're cycling. Even while we seek God, he is seeking us. I love the way Ambrose of Milan in Italy put it. This is in the late 300s, early Christian. As in paradise, think of Eden, God walks in Scripture seeking man. So yes, we seek the Lord, but biblically he's seeking us. Finally, if we already have a relationship with God, let's join him in seeking those who do not. I was in a friend's house in Manchester a few weeks ago, and I saw this piece of paper framed on the wall, and it said Carpathia. I thought, that's amazing. I took a picture. I even created my own facsimile, because that's the ship that helped the Titanic. See, the world is not just without God, it's without hope, because our hope is in God, because God is the creator, he is the Father. The world without God is described as without hope. Now, the Carpathia couldn't help everybody. It was a couple hours away, but they turned around. They're actually heading for Boston. They went back, and this is the captain's words that were sent to Associated Press, New York. Titanic struck, iceberg sunk. Monday, 3 a.m. coordinates. Carpathia picked up many passengers and proceeding New York, Captain Rostler. They rescued more than 700. They couldn't get the other 1,500 or so, but they were working together. In a way, when you know God, you're part of a colossal search and rescue effort, because the world blithely goes on its way, cycling on thin ice, or in this case, being struck by ice and drowning. It's just an illustration. But please think about that we have something to offer, not because we're so good, but we're well positioned to turn around, to change the direction of our life, and help those who need help because of what God has given us in Jesus Christ. So those are my thoughts. Some of the objections answered, a number of reasons why theism, to me, makes much more sense, and what the implications are, and just a bit of challenge for us, since you gave me your normal sermon slot. God bless you all.